Well, that time of the season's coming up. It's just about here. At least a season that a lot of folks like, and that's the summertime. When I was a kid, I loved the summer. But nowadays, I think I prefer the spring and the fall. But the thing about the summer is that when the summer comes, the heat goes up and the clothes start diminishing in those in the world. And I thought, well, this might be a good time to preach about God's desires for men and women's clothing. What I have here is a chart that maybe, hopefully, I'll be able to preach on this in a much more expanded way. But here we have a couple, and we have a man and a woman, and they have a decision to make because they have these various issues, these issues of morals, abortion, clothing, cussing, dancing, etc. And so the decision is to be made by them and us, and those that we can try to teach and influence, as to are these things right in God's sight or are they not? What's God's limits if He has anything to say about them at all? And so we have the right and the wrong standards to determine what is right and wrong. We all have different standards, whether we know it or not. Those in the world who do not even believe in God, they have their standards, but it's not the ones we want. But the thing that we see here in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 9 through 11, is that our morals will determine our destiny. If these morals are part of God's rulings and laws, and if we disobey these things, yes, they come into play. Not just the doctrinal things, not how the church is to be organized and all those things only, but morals are so much of Judgment Day's decisions. Now, there are some wrong standards. One of these days, hopefully, we'll be able to look at these. I have 14 up on the screen, but these are some standards that human beings, people in the world, and if we're not careful, people in the church will use these standards because these are the standards that they learn from other people on how they make decisions, whether they're going to do something or not. And lo and behold, we get these standards out of the educational process of Satan when he takes over the schools and the writers and the script writers of television programs, that they teach morals through the actions and the examples that are portrayed up on the screen and in the books. And we people, say we, not necessarily us, but it can be the case, that we adapt these principles to our thinking. We find ourselves maybe unknowingly making decisions because, well, that's the way so-and-so did it on television. So yes, there are some wrong standards, but the right standard, as we well know, that is the standard of the Bible. In 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16 through 17, tells us that the Scripture is inspired by God, and it tells us what it can be used for, that the man and woman of God might be perfectly, thoroughly furnished unto all good works. So yes, God has given us the right standard in the Bible. But the one I'd like for us to look at this morning is clothing. What about our apparel? You know, we have our bodies and we wear our clothing. Even laws of government have certain kind of laws of how we need to be dressed and so forth. I'd like for us to consider our clothing. Now, I want to back up to Genesis, in Genesis chapter 1, 2, and 3, because in these chapters, it's so crucial because God sets forth some principles for all mankind. His dealings with Adam and Eve are not only for them, but since they're the first man and the first woman, as God is giving them, we'll look at some of these things, that God is telling them, here's things that you are to be like and to do and so forth. He's given it not just for Adam and Eve, but it's for mankind. And so he sets forth some principles for all of us, all mankind, whether in this country or another country, years back or whatever it might be in front of us, by means of his actions, his dealings with Adam and Eve. First of all, we see in Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, that there's to be one man for one woman for life. It says, and man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. How do we know that this is for all time, all people? Who was Adam and Eve's mother and father that he was to leave? So it wasn't just, Adam, this is the way it is for you, but it's for a man, that is mankind. What God is saying here is, this is for all mankind. To be joined means to cling or cleave or to keep close. That's from a lexicon, I think perhaps the most highly esteemed lexicon of the Hebrew language. To his wife. Well, that means it excludes everything else. Adam, you are to cleave to your wife. So here he explicitly tells us and gives us limitations by simply telling us what he is to do, and all of us likewise. So here we have a state of being in oneness, one man for one woman for life. And it goes vice versa, one woman for one man for life. But notice in Matthew chapter 19, verses 4 through 5, what's going on. The disciples asked him a question about divorce because the Jewish people had very loose laws about divorcing. And so the disciples, understanding that Jesus was bringing into his laws, they asked him. And Jesus quoted this passage. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, this passage here, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined, cleaved to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Then he says, therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate. So here we see quite clearly that God was not saying that this was something just for Adam and Eve, but for all mankind. So yes, it's true at the top. God set forth some principles for all mankind by means of his actions and instructions with Adam and Eve. Let's look at another one. The wife is the helper fit for the husband. This is in chapter 2, verse 18 of Genesis. Now, we see that this refers to all of mankind because in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 7 through 11, it refers back to this passage, making the point that yes, the wife is to be the helper, the helpmate for the man. So if it was just for Adam and Eve, why would inspiration be referring back to it, saying, hey, that applies to you Corinthians? Because it's for all people, for all times. Also, thirdly, the husband is to be the head of the wife, Genesis 3:16. But again, same thing, 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 11 through 14, refers back to that Old Testament passage, showing that it was also for those people of that time. The fourth thing, man is responsible for working in sustenance, chapter 3, verses 17 through 18. And this is retaught in the New Testament, in those two passages that we have up on the screen. So again, what God was saying for Adam and Eve was not just for them, but it was for mankind as they had their children, and then the grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and on and on and on. That was the laws to be passed down to them. Now notice this one. Proper covering to cover nakedness. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 20. Now, I got to ask, if this was just Adam and Eve, here's your clothes. You got to wear them now. Was that just for them? Well, what if Cain and Abel and Seth, would it be okay then for them to run around bare-chested? And there any sisters near that? Well, God's not a respecter of persons, is he? Acts chapter, let me get it up here. In Acts chapter 10, verse 34, God's not a respecter of persons. So what he told Adam and Eve to do, then also the children and the grandchildren, and on and on and on down to us. So this was something for mankind when God gave them the cloaks. But also something else. Why, since Adam and Eve were husband and wife, why would God be telling them to wear clothes? Unless it was a principle for when there was mankind. And then also, there are no other people from whom they need to be concealed. But anticipating the time that there would be a population upon the earth, yeah, they needed to be clothed. God was setting a principle for them, just like the above four, that when God gave them clothing, He's saying mankind needs to be clothed as they are out. Now, what we see then, that this indeed is a principle for everyone. So yes, God does set forth principles for all mankind through His dealings with Adam and Eve, and one of these is the proper clothing to cover nakedness. So let's look at this one a little bit more detail. Yes, God sets forth principles, but also God defines nakedness. Now, the Bible oftentimes defines words, defines meanings and actions, like Marion presented wonderfully this morning about in the Lord, tremendous. God defines what faith means in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. Yes, God defines things, and likewise He defines nakedness here by His actions and what He did. Let's take a look. Now, God clothed them. Why? For the purpose that they would not be naked. They ate the fruit. Their eyes were open. They now understood things, and they understood that they were not properly clothed, and they were shamed, and they sewed together those leaves and tried to make some kind of clothing there. So God gave them clothes. Why? Was it too hot outside or too cold? Raining? No, they didn't have any of those things as we understand from previous teachings. Why are they being clothed? For the purpose that they would not be naked. Now, notice this. If God did not cover enough, what was He doing? He was trying to cover nakedness. Then He failed in what He was trying to do. If God had in His mind, this much, from top to bottom, this much, and He only covered that much, then He wasn't covering nakedness. He failed in His purpose. But God does not fail. In Mark 14:36, Father, Jesus is speaking, all things are possible for you. In Revelation 19, I believe verse 6, about the omnipotence, omnipotent, all-powerful. God does not fail when He is doing something that He's wanting to do. God didn't fail when people have sinned because He's given us the prerogative to make a choice. So it's not God's fault that we sin. So when God has His things that He's doing, He is not going to fail. So when God clothed Adam and Eve, this is what He wanted clothed. What was He clothing? Nakedness. And He covered it. He wasn't too short on that. But also, if He covered more than was needed. All right, here's nakedness God had to find. Let's have Adam and Eve up here. Here's nakedness, and He gave it more, a lot further. It was dragging the ground, and maybe they had a hood on top of them, and maybe some kind of scarf in front of them. If He did more, then what's the problem? He did that which was unnecessary or wasteful. What was God trying to do? He was giving them clothing to cover nakedness. And He's perfect in what He does. And so therefore God was not going to be wasteful. The technical word for it is parsimony. I just simply say, based upon God's perfection, God only does what He needs to do to get things done right. So if this is the right limit, then that's all God's going to do. He's not going to make it too short because God's all powerful. He does, his works are perfect. He's not going to make it too much. Why? Because he's clothing nakedness. And the purpose was to clothe exactly what he was trying to clothe. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 4, it says, his work is perfect. So when he made those clothings, it was perfect. Not too small, not too much. So, by clothing Adam and Eve's nakedness, God shows man what it takes to not be naked according to him. We don't look at what others are wearing. We don't listen to the definitions of society. We don't listen to the definitions of government. We don't look at Webster's, because Webster simply records how the words are being used by the culture of that time. We've got to look back at what God is saying according to him. Yes, God defines nakedness by how much he covered. So if we can find out, okay, just what did God use? Do we have any way possible of knowing what kind of garment God clothed them with, how high up it was and how low it was, so we can understand what God's talking about here? In Genesis 3, verse 21, it says God made, and I'm going to use the Hebrew word here, instead of tunics, God made kethnot. I had this word spicked down right. Kethoneth of skin and clothe him. He made a kethoneth. That is in the Hebrew word. So what is this kethoneth? If we can, what is it? Well, we happen to have ways of finding out. Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew Lexicon says it was a tunic, a long shirt-like garment. Well, I've been to stores, to Kohl's and Penny's and so forth, and I know that they have some nightgowns that they're here, and then they're just long shirts. Well, that's giving me a pretty good idea. Do we have something else that might help us? How high did this kethoneth extend? Here's a passage that uses that same word, and it explains it. Job's disease, it binds me about as the collar of my, and there it is, the kethoneth, as the collar. Well, Job had that disease of the boils, and it would ooze and so forth. And evidently, what he's talking about in that passage is that was getting over his clothing, and it was just kind of drawn up. And so it is something that was drawing up close, up high to him, not way down. So here we see that, yes, as Brown Driver Briggs was pointing out in their lexicon, it was a tunic, a long shirt-like garment. It came up pretty high. But how low did the kethoneth extend? The International Standard Bible Encyclopedia says the coat or the tunic in the New Testament, the word is chiton, it corresponds to the kethoneth, extended down to the knees. Extended down to the knees. But yet another way we can determine this is what God shows us in the Old Testament. In Exodus chapter 28, verse 42 and 43, it says, you shall make for them the priests. I'll explain that in a minute. Linen trousers to cover their nakedness. There it is again. To cover their nakedness. Make the trousers to cover nakedness. They shall reach from the waist to the thighs. Now what's going on here was that the priests were going up on some steps or some platform, and they were up higher, and so they had the kethoneth on down to the knees, but lo and behold, being down at an angle, they could see up higher up on the thighs. And so God said, well, look, that's not going to work. Now what you need to do is cover their nakedness again. That you need to make these trousers or the long underwear. But it went down from the waist to the thighs. To the thighs, to the thighs. Well, our thighs are pretty long. It starts just above the knee and goes up to our hips. So, what are we talking about? 1 inch above the knee, or we're talking about 18, 20 inches above the knee. What's the nakedness? Well, the word "to" there is the Hebrew word "od," and this word means even unto, as far or long or as much as. So it's an inclusive, and that comes from Strong's. So the meaning of this "od" is inclusive. In other words, not just down to the beginning of the thigh, but it includes the thigh down to the knees. And so here we see this kethloneth starts up here and it goes down to the knees. And that's when God is covering nakedness. Not too much, not too little. God covered nakedness precisely and exactly. So yes, God does define nakedness by how much he covered on Adam and Eve. And it goes to the collar, extending down to the knees, like a long shirt garment. So the kethloneth concealed the body's form rather than revealed it. So now we're not just simply talking about the visible part that we can see, but notice also the kethloneth is going to explain that it conceals the form of the body. I thank God that we don't have people dressing like the world does as we assemble here. Because, boy, you're out in the world, you go shopping, wherever you might be, and yeah, they might have all the skin covered, but it's just kind of drawn up, is it not? Like wet leather just, shrinks when it dries up. That's not the kind of clothing that God's talking about here, because the kethloneth concealed the form. And we know this because a long shirt just hangs, and that conceals basically the form. It doesn't contour a body as it's drawn up by elastic. Furthermore, God used skins of animals. Skins of animals, well, they're dense. Have you ever seen an animal skin? My son-in-law has a skin of, I believe it's a cow that they raised, and it's for the carpet on the hardwood. But you pick that thing up and you have a flashlight behind it, and you can't see the light behind it. It's dense. It's thick. You don't see it. And God did not make the kethloneth out of straw. I've seen straw hats and kind of meshed like that, and you can kind of see through them. Now, God could have used straw, but that's not what he used. He used something that would hang down and cover the form, and it would not allow vision to penetrate. So what we see here then, as we put all this together, that since, not if, but since all mankind is to be properly clothed in order to cover nakedness, and since God was defining with Adam and Eve the measures needed to cover nakedness, not too short, not too long, and since God's definition of naked can be known, as we saw in the passages, that means, as you put all this together, as we've done previously in the sermon, then the Christian is to be properly clothed according to the principles of height, length, fullness, and density as established by God and in his covering the nakedness of Adam and Eve. Thanks be to God for good Christian women. Thanks be to God for the women here in this congregation. And hopefully the things that we've been able to look at, we keep it in our mind. If we have to help somebody else to learn it, we have the material to do it with. But there might be some objections. The question might be, well, now wait a minute, does that mean that we're supposed to wear these tunics? Are we supposed to walk around these big old gunny sacks type things? No, not at all. What God is doing here, he's given us the principles of covering nakedness with this tunic. And our styles and our customs might differ as long as they meet those principles. And we need to know this to be the case because when Jesus lived, they didn't have the kethloneth. Customs had changed, but yet it was still a covering, the tunic. No, they had the cloak at that time, and it fit the principles that we see here. So yes, we have changes in our customs and the designs and so forth, but our clothes need to meet the principles that God has given to us at the very beginning. Compare mankind's first principle. Man is the sustainer. Well, the occupation is his choice, but he needs to meet the principle that he's the one who's supposed to have the burden on his shoulders. Not that the wife can't earn things too. That's not it at all. But the primary responsibility is upon the man. He's got to bear the burden. Take care of this. So we have options, but we need to stay with the principles. Okay, well, what about this one? Now, doesn't proper attire change due to culture? In America, we got lower necklines, higher hemlines, and we expose the midsections. That's just simply our culture. Christians just need to be more modest than the world. As 2 Timothy 2, verse 9 says, that we need to wear modest apparel. So, as long as I'm, maybe a couple inches higher up here and a couple inches lower down here, and I don't have a midriff showing, then, I'm modest. I'm modest. Well, that's something that can be easily thought of, but we got some very serious problems with that, which helps us see that is not the case. Culture has no effect upon what we see here in Genesis chapter 3, verse 21. God's law on marriage in Genesis 3 has not changed due to culture. Culture has changed, that law for themselves, but it hasn't changed God's law. So the culture standard makes the world the standard by which we're to live, and it's a wrong standard. Decades ago, dresses from pictures that I've seen of the old ancient pictures, they were very fluffed dresses and clothing. It would go, down to the ankles, and I wasn't there when this happened, but I was told that when they raised the dresses above the ankles, that caused an outroar against the more conservative people. Things have changed. So as the hemlines get lower and the dresses get higher, are we just supposed to stay, a couple inches higher here and a couple inches lower there? Well, what happens is in time, if that's the case, if that's the standard, we're meeting the morals that might have existed 2-3 decades ago. And God's laws doesn't fluctuate. So it makes the wrong standard. Also, this cultural standard makes God's standard subjective, which is false. Whatever the culture is, it's just flexible and it's subjective. God's laws are never subjective. Another question. But aren't we supposed to dress for the occasion? When you go swimming, you're supposed to wear a swimming suit. You don't wear your suit and you don't wear the long dresses. Some athletics, you got to wear these kind of outfits. Well, again, that's not going to have any effect upon what God is saying here. No occasion takes precedence over God's laws. No occasion takes precedence over God's laws. In Acts chapter 5, verse 29, it says we ought to obey God rather than man. And that's including God's commandments, let alone the whims and desires of a society. Has no effect. What if the occasion expected you to drink liquor, expected you to do drugs, expected you to just name it. Just name it. Just because it's the occasion that we need to ignore what God is telling us here in Genesis 3? No. Of course, that doesn't work. Situation ethics has never been God's ethics. In Matthew chapter 12, it points that out. God's ethics does not have gray spances. It's black or white. We just got to study it a little deeper to make sure we grasp it. And another question, I really don't think I'm causing other people to stumble uh, by the way I dress. I'm not causing other people to lust. You know, so I'm okay. But the Bible tells us that we don't know what they're thinking. We don't. It tells us, for what man knows the things of a man except the spirit, except the thoughts of the man which is in him. Yeah. We don't know what other people are thinking. And so yet we stay with what God tells us. Now the thing is, producing lust is not the issue here in Genesis chapter 3. Rather, the issue is the covering of nakedness, according to God. And so we don't need to say, I'm not causing people to lust. That's not the thing. Might be happening, but God is telling us, here's the way to be covered. Here's the way to be clothed. No doubt to keep lust contained, but still that's the principle. Some might think, I'm just too old. People, I'm not going to be attractive to other people. That's not the issue either. The issue is, here's what God said to do to be clothed. It wasn't Adam and Eve by themselves when God gave them the clothes. Uh, it wasn't to protect each other from lusting, and there wasn't anybody else, so it wasn't the issue. But it was simply how proper to be clothed. What about Shem and Japheth? Now, this is powerful. They covered Noah's nakedness, not because they wanted to keep from lusting, but rather nakedness is simply to be covered. Genesis chapter 9. That here after the flood and the grapes fermented and Noah drank of it and he was innocent in this. I mean, he didn't intend to get drunk. He didn't know anything about it. This is brand new to him. So yet he was laying there in his tent naked, and one of the sons ran out and just laughed and in essence was exposing by sight, referring the other two brothers to go look. And God condemned that in a big way. But rather, Shem and Japheth, they put the clothing on their back, and they walked back with it, and they laid it on him. And they were blessed because why? They covered nakedness. Yes, indeed, this is a very serious thing that God is telling us here. So yes, God sets forth some principles for all mankind, all time, all places, by means of his actions with Adam and Eve. We looked at these four, and then we emphasized the fifth one. And so it also, of course, includes the proper covering to cover nakedness. I hope that this has been helpful. I feel like this doesn't need to be preached to this congregation, men or women, but it helps us, and hopefully it can help others. Now, I tried to be as decent as I could about this, but I wanted us to get the point. In the morning, when we don't have a morning like today, we're staying there, we're watching for the rising of the sun. Those who are out hunting, watching for the rising of the sun, because you can't shoot until the sun comes up, so you're watching for the sun. So now tell me when, now you don't have to tell me, but in your own mind, when do you see the sun? It's going to rise here somewhere. When do you see the sun? You see the sun? Well, do you see the sun when some of the sun is exposed? You see the sun. All of the sun does not have to be exposed in order for it to be seen. We know that. And the way that people are dressing today, particularly I'm concerned about women and the way that the way they dress. You don't have to see all the sun to see some of the sun, and we are to cover ourselves in that way. That illustration, I hope, will be helpful to those that you might have to help. So yes, right and wrong standards to determine what is right and wrong. Clothing is one of those moral issues, and our morals will be a determining factor at Judgment Day. We don't use any of these standards, culture or anything, but the right standard is there in the Bible, of which God gives to us, and he gives us the laws by which he wants to live. So, brethren, may we, as God's people, maintain what we have in spite of what the culture might be doing round about us. and be an example to others for how sorely they need the examples. The invitation song has been selected. In order to become a Christian, to live right, to be able to be ready for that judgment day, to live by God's standards, we need to come into His favor by His standard. And in spite of the fact that so many denominations, so many theologians teach different things on, hey, here's how you need to be saved, here's what God says. Once again, let's go to the book. He tells us in Acts chapter 2, Mark chapter 16, verse 16, that we need to believe to be saved. He tells us in Acts chapter 2, verse 38, that we need to have that repentance. Romans chapter 10, 9 and 10, we need to have that confession. And then also back to Mark 16:16, to be baptized. By our faith, we have a change of heart. And that change of heart, we are told that we need to confess that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. Then by that faith, we are immersed. We obey what God tells us to do. And when we are baptized, then we are saved. Our sins are washed away. They're remitted, forgiven, and we have put on Christ. We're walking in the new life. We have that new birth. All those passages in the Bible that people seem to overlook is all determined by the point of being baptized. If you're a Christian, that you need the prayers of the congregation. If you need to make some confession, if it's a public sin, a public confession, we pray for you. And God will forgive us. God will forgive us. So once you come, as together we stand and as we sing.